Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize Raw. I'm your host, David Russell, with my co-host, David Paulman. Oh, wait, no, David's not here. He decided to sleep in today. I don't know what's going on with him. David, if you get this and you get the call, just join us. It's okay. But this is Raw. This is why we do it. I'm actually here today with my good friend, Rob Lundberg. He's going to be with us today. He's actually decided he wants to stay on and help with the response video that we're making. So Rob is no stranger to Proselytize or Apostatize. It's been a while since he's been on, so I'm going to let him reintroduce himself. How you doing, Rob?
I'm doing well, David. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, sir. I mean, tell us a little about your ministry, and I love to praise local apologists, so tell us what you do and where you do it.
Well, I guess to start, we are the founder and the director of the Real Issue Apologetics Ministry. We're based in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And also we have the Virginia Center for Public Christianity, because of the fact that the culture is getting really, really skeptical and secular. So we figured we'd make that an arm of the Real Issue Apologetics Ministry. We had a 6-year run with Ratio Christi, but since we didn't have any students and student interest, we're just in direct contact with them now. But we've been involved in apologetics for over 30 years, and I'm a former skeptic, and that's how I got myself immersed in it, because I started asking questions that Christians could not answer, and because of that, I wanted to know why. And I'm not a Christian because Christianity works. I'm a Christian because Christianity is true. It's evidentially true.
Right on. Thanks, Rob. You know, one of the things you mentioned there was the culture. And before we get into the interview, I just want your thoughts on, what's going on today. We see riots, we see racial injustice that, is being touted around, and cities are getting taken over at some points. But then we have this coronavirus and this pandemic that's going on. So give us some of your thoughts on the current events right now.
Wow, this could really be a whole show that you could really do on this, but just in a short synopsis, I think that I would give you would be the fact that, well, whenever you throw truth out, you end up in a post-truth culture. You end up in a postmodern culture. Of course, postmodernism has been around with us for a little while, and it's taken different shapes. But then, of course, if truth doesn't exist, then morals don't exist. If morals don't exist, then basically it's fair game for everybody else. So now when you go and you look at the pandemic that's going on, it's taken apologists like you and myself and others to basically do what we're doing to reach out. And, behind every person, there is a question or an objection, and that's one of the things that we operate with regards to engaging people in a conversational type evangelism. But one of the things, David, I'm finding out is that the people, as a result of today, they're looking for hope, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for purpose. And having been mentored by Ravi Zacharias, I've learned a lot through his ministry, the fact that, whenever you go and you throw truth out, whenever you go and throw truth morals out, you have nothing to stand on, nothing to jettison yourself off of in order for an objective moral standard. So what we see today with things like Black Lives Matter, by the way, I want to just say this, and I know it's on the podcast, I do support the statement Black Lives Matter, but I do not support the movement because of its foundational underpinnings. But, when you have all this and you throw truth out and you have all this search for social justice, you have all of this racial profiling, racial critical theory, and you have intersectionality and racial theory, you end up going, my hurt is is stronger than your hurt. My truth is better than your truth. And right now, culture is a mess. It's a mess. And of course, it's a different type of battlefront now that we're seeing as far as the ideologies, because Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 that we're to tear down the strongholds of the culture. We're to tear down those ideologies that come up against the knowledge of God. So what we are seeing now is basically people looking for truth, but they're using their own truth and their own morals to determine what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false.
Yeah, I hear you there. I don't think this has been an easy year for apologists either. I mean, we did lose Ravi Zacharias this year, didn't we?
We lost Ravi G, and a year or so ago, we lost my other mentor, Dr. Norman Geisler.
Yep. Yeah, it's been a rocky road there too. I mean, losing somebody like Ravi was a real big hit to me because, he was, like you said, he's like a mentor, and I just, I learned so much from him. Yeah. And one of the things that you said about culture being a mess, he spoke to the culture in a way I don't think anybody else could have. And it doesn't matter where you're from. He spoke all over the world, and I just wanted to honor that. And, just say a little something about it because I loved Ravi G, and there's no words that can express that loss to our community. Some like yourself that actually do the groundwork of apologetics. So when you said culture is a mess, and this is I'm going to turn the tables around on you here because you do this all the time. What do you mean by mess?
Well, it's a mess because if you look at the history of the church today, I really believe that the problem with America today is not America. I believe the problem today with America is the Christian church. And that's because we have become really soft in our thinking. It is because we think music is everything, and it's not just a part of worship. We don't think anymore. We are afraid to use our minds. Basically, we have dismissed the mind from fellowship in many, many pockets of American Christianity today. And when you go on, you do not have a voice in culture. When the church basically has started to allow things like critical theory, critical race theory, when you start seeing the fact that the culture starts smelling, the culture has crept into the church, with the church in many churches today, you start seeing the culture in the church, and the church has lost its identity. So if the culture is a mess, the church is not too far behind it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this in these introductions, I like to talk about current events because I see the route the country's heading. I see the route that the church is heading, and it is kind of scary. Now, a lot of people that I talk to, and I don't know if you're getting this too, are telling us we're in the end times. And you get all this. Well, this pandemic's in the Bible. What are your thoughts on where we are in relation to this? Is this the end times, or are we just facing another pandemic like we did in the Cyprian plague?
I think we are just seeing another plague, because I think the folks that make the claim that we're in the end times, you got to realize Paul wrote about the end times in the first century. He talked about the imminency of the return of Jesus. And, you go through all a couple millennia forward, and you go through, you get into the 80s. I became a Christian in 1980. And there was a lot of talk with the people that were in public office and political office. And people were trying to play pin the tail on the Antichrist. And and they're saying, oh, we're in the end times. We're in the end times. We were saying that with there were people saying that with the previous administration and all. And of course, we have to remember as American Christians that America is nowhere found in biblical prophecy. Yeah, America is nowhere found in biblical prophecy. I hold to a premillennial historical. I don't hold to the escapist view of dispensationalism. I think that when we are called to be Christians, we are called to suffer, but there's an answer for suffering, because this answering to suffering was found at the cross, where you have love, justice, evil, and forgiveness, all in an act of evil against the sinless man, and that's Jesus Christ, who committed no sin. But he did that as our substitute, praise the Lord, so that we could have that meaning, so we could have that purpose, so that we could live with that in mind, so that we could go out, as James says, show our faith by what we do. And of course, we're saved by grace through faith, and then unto works. And of course, when you start dealing with faith and works and everything, you get a lot of liberal denominations that think works and all. And of course, that's crept into the church too, with churches getting involved in governmental agencies, allowing the camel in the tent.
Yeah. Well, I hear you there, and I'm a big believer that you can't look for prophecies out of the clippings of the newspaper. So, and yeah, I do hold to a partial preterist type view of the end. I do think Christ is coming back, but yeah, a lot of these fears, they're caused by ignorance. The early church, I don't think, had a lot of that, and they would just go out and they impacted the world. I helped author a book with a couple skeptics and some Christians not too long ago, and I talked about how the early church impacted the world. And it was because, when the Cyprian plague came, they were reporting maybe 5,000 people would die a day. I mean, and that's probably exaggerated, but the Christians died along with them. And what the pagans took note of is that the Christians took care of the people that were dying. They didn't leave them out in the street and flee the town. They stuck in there, and they died along with them. And it's reflected in the bishop's letter there. And it was really cool how the early church impacted the world. And I think that's where we need to be at today. So just out of that, I'm compelled to maybe go out and, mow somebody's lawn that's high risk, and do things for the community and try to help where it's needed. Right. I give to certain organizations that I feel best represent me. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what you think, but
I think that's something, people need to see Christianity in action. And I think with the fact that we need to get out there, we need to be careful, but at the same time, we don't just go willy-nilly, throw ourselves to the lions and all. But I think if we just understand that the early church was in a Roman culture under the Caesars, under Nero, when Paul was beheaded, those Christians were living out, and of course the mandate of 1 Peter 3:15 really comes to mind here, as well as Romans 12:1 and 2. And I'll just start there. It says, I urge you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might be able to prove what the will of God is. And that's, of course, going out and putting it in action. And, that you might be able to prove what the will of God, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect, and then taking that and springboarding off of that, what Paul says, Peter says, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready always to give a reason for the hope that you have with gentleness and respect. And of course, this is bringing in and tying in the great commandment, which says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. You can't do the reaching out to people until we start loving God vertically with our heart and our soul and our mind.
Amen to that, brother. Well, that's one Rob Lundberg's view on current events, ladies and gentlemen. And with that ends this segment. And I hope you guys stay tuned, because we got the interview next, and we'll be back with you shortly. Hello and welcome back to PRA Raw. Again, we're here with Rob Lundberg, and uh, we're kind of going to piggyback on kind of Rob's take here on the church being the problem in America. And I wanted to ask him because he had a podcast not too long ago called "How the Church Lost Its Evangelical Mind," and that's the first question, Rob. How has the church lost its evangelical mind?
Well, do you want the long version or the Reader's Digest condensed version? Because I
Well,
wrote a blog. I wrote a blog on this too, and I springboard that podcast off of the blog posting. But I guess to put it in a nice, neat package, and then maybe we can expound on it a little bit. I break it down into a few periods. Basically, what you have is the age of the Puritans, so the era of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, where you had a high level of scholasticism, and the mind was invited into fellowship in the church. You had universities, you had preachers like Jonathan Edwards and others, Cotton Mather, who once said, "Ignorance is the mother of not of devotion, but of heresy." He was a pastor, and of course, ignorance was not seen as a virtue back during that period. And then you move to the 1800s. Excuse me. You move to the 1800s, and then you have like Puritan scholasticism, with the moving from Puritan scholasticism, and the middle 1800s showed a dramatic shift. The seeds of change happened to started taking place, where you had ministers going up and down the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers, up in the burned over district of New York, where I moved from there to move down here to Virginia. You had three awakenings. You had the Great Awakening, the first one. You had the second one. The first Great Awakening was like right around 1730s to about 1750. And then you move into the 1800s, and then you have the Second Awakening with 1800 to 1820, and the revivals of Charles Finney, and the Layman's Prayer Revival during the period of 1856 to 1859. So with those movements and everything, you start having a type of turn or burn type evangelism. Not a whole lot of scholasticism. By the way, back during the Puritan and Pilgrim era, you had universities like Yale, Harvard, Princeton. All of those were started off as seminaries. You had a high level of scholasticism, and back during that period of time, David, the pastor was not seen as dangerous or a bumbling buffoon. He was seen as a person who had not a lot of knowledge, and would be one that people could consult with for truth and how to respond to things that were going on back then. But that changed in the 1800s. And then, of course, you had the withdrawal of the evangelical mind with the philosophers and all.
So what do you think caused that divide between the pastors and the laity, the pastors being seen as somebody that could, be consulted on matters of truth and knowledge?
Well, when you start changing your theology, you start changing how you see your view of coming to belief or coming to the knowledge of God, and you start seeing that change going from the intellectual to the heart and the emotions, that all of a sudden that spreads like a wildfire inside the church. Of course, one of the things I think that's very important is that we need to understand that conversions were taking place. But when you start going and making it more about emotion and experience, you start going away from the mind. Okay. You're not dovetailing the heart, soul, and mind like the Great Commandment tells us.
Yeah.
You're dealing with just the heart, which is the seat of the emotions. It's the part of our soul. It is our soulishness, but also is the mind. And I think we went from a 3/3 to 2/3 soulishness and understanding of that.
Yeah. So, how did we get here? How did we get to that point? How do we get to that point where we abandon the mind? Is it the double-edged sword of religious liberty that could be part of it? And I mean, I've always said that that is a double-edged sword because it's necessary for free people, but it can quickly give way to false theologians and false prophets that don't really study it, but they just, I mean, anybody can pick up a Bible and read it, but to read a 2,000-year-old manuscript, you're going to need some background.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's where the withdrawal of the evangelical mind happened, because this is the heartbreaking part of it all, when anti-intellectualism really started. I've been writing on anti-intellectualism for a little while now, but when you really start going back to it, it really goes back to the 1800s, when you have the philosophical ideas of Europe coming in. The first philosophical front came with David Hume in 1711 to 1776, and Immanuel Kant. And of course, these two philosophers were very influential in influencing people's thinking and scholars' thinking, theologians' thinking. David Hume claimed that the traditional arguments for the existence of God, the world is an effect that needs a personal cause, they were quite weak. Hume also stated that since we cannot experience God with our five senses, there's no way to be able to claim religious knowledge. And then looking at it another way, you look at it from Immanuel Kant's perspective. He asserted that human knowledge is essentially limited to what can be experienced with the five senses. And since God cannot be experienced, we don't know if God exists or not. And the ideas of Hume and Kant, these guys really did a lot of damage across Europe and even in the American states. Now, when you look at their arguments, they had a great influence toward the shaking of the arguments for the existence of God and the rationality of the Christian faith, because what happened was that crept into the seminaries. And then, of course, when you get to the seminaries, and I've had one rodeo as a pastor, and I noticed the influence of liberal theology that has crept into America. So you look at the German schools, like in Tübingen and Baden-Württemberg. You look at those, and they called into the question of the authenticity and the authority of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Mosaic text, Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And also, this is when we started seeing the search for the real Jesus, or the search for Jesus and the Christ of faith. You had those folks like Schleiermacher and Bultmann and all those guys. With that, if you have this influence of the pastors getting these teachings in the seminaries in the United States, the shift, the ideological shift from like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale being sound in the 17th century, now in the 18th century, and the 19th century, we're in a problem with the seminaries. You know that the moniker, you see the sweatshirt for Harvard, it says Veritas, which is Latin for truth.
Yeah.
Well, it used to say Veritas pro Christo e Ecclesia, which is truth for Christ and the church. So when you have German higher criticism challenging the authenticity of the Bible, challenging the historical Jesus, challenging all of the things that Christians believe to be true from what scriptures with sound biblical theology teaches, we're in a lot of trouble. And of course, I mentioned that I was a pastor in a local county just south of us, and I ran into liberal pastors. I was one of 3 Bible-believing, inerrancy-believing pastors in a county, and it was pretty fascinating, just some of the stuff. I ended up going and telling one pastor, go back to your church and tell your people what you don't believe about the Bible, because I know you've got good people in that church. Tell them what you don't believe. They want their pastor to be honest with them. Of course, they didn't. And of course, then, you deal with the the German liberal schools, and then of course you got the ghost of Darwin still with us today, and that's the third front where the evangelical mind basically withdrew. In the scientific setting, Darwinian evolution emerged as made the world safe for atheists, and of course we have atheists today. Basically, some of them are anti-theistic and just using their rhetoric, and not a whole lot of reason. But then you do have your intelligent atheists out there, and of course 9/11 changed the way atheism was shaped. Even though you had guys like Kai Nielsen, Brian Leiter, and John Gray over in Europe. You have the rhetoric, the pop atheists that are pushing Darwinism. And what's one of the things whenever we get involved in a conversation with somebody, especially when I've gone to 2 Reason rallies up in DC, they are just waiting to set the trap with a pre-sup Christian who means well and arguing for 6 days of creation, and then all of a sudden you end up butting heads with the creation versus evolution debate, and that's not where you want to go with it. You want to deal with the fact that there is a God that does exist, and that there's good reasons, good arguments for the existence of God, like the cosmological, teleological, the argument from design, and the axiological, which is the moral argument, as well as the argument from beauty. And there's a bunch of them out there. But when you start dealing with Darwinism, and you deal with the German Tübingen school, and you deal with the Kant and Hume, that's where America and the American church really started declining.
So where were the apologists during that time? Because if I'm not mistaken, I think the person that probably did the most damage to Hume is C.S. Lewis.
Well, they were writing, and of course there were the decisions, not the decisions, but the discourses. But you look at the time periods of Hume and Kant; they were a little earlier than Lewis, and I'm sure.
Yeah.
And of course, Tolkien was very influential for C.S. Lewis coming to belief and faith in Christ. They were there, but they were basically seen as, well, I guess as too rigorous and not relevant to the emotional experiential church, because what you had was emotional theology, you had emotional decisions, even though conversions were happening. But don't confuse me with the facts. Just give me Jesus is basically the whole thing.
Yeah, and like we're saying, Hume and Kant were before Lewis. So where were the apologists in that 100 and some years battling?
Well, I'm sure they were there, but I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at my studies on that.
Yeah, and how relevant were they? Because we have G.K. Chesterton, right? I mean, he definitely made a name for himself.
He was late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah, and
well,
before that, but we're looking at where's the other guys. I mean, I'm not
right.
But I do know some people that have looked into historical apologetics, and that's another interesting track to follow. And of course, I don't have the relevant data here, but yeah, the one thing you did kind of mention is that. And this is kind of going back to harping on the idea that the problem with America is the church.
Yeah.
And is the church responsible for the state of morale in America?
I think that the church has always been a catalyst for morale in America. Is it the what is it that I'm looking for? Is it the standard for morality? Does the church have an answer for the standard of morality? I believe it does, because it holds to the standard of the moral law of God. And of course, how that's all applied is how you get your denominations and abominations and everything that are out there today. But Is the church responsible for the morale of culture? Of course, you look at the 60s and the 70s with Jerry Falwell, and more so in the 70s with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. That was a driving force. You look at the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. and the push for equal rights for every human being. I think that the church has always had a voice in that, but at the same time, the culture has always bucked against it. Of course, whenever you had like Martin Luther King and others like him in his era, you had Woodstock and peace, love, drugs, dope, and all that other stuff. Whenever you have a response to the church, you have somebody like Madeleine Murray O'Hair speaking against Jerry Falwell with the moral majority, and you have Hugh Hefner and others like him speaking against the moral majority during that period of time. So there's always a response from one side and the other. And the question is, how is that response to the ills of our culture presented?
Yeah, so you did say one thing in the podcast that really caught my attention. It was we gave up a lot of ground. The church gave up a lot of ground. If you could expound on that just a little bit, what do you mean by what ground did they give?
Well, when you take a look at what I've just summarized and take it just right back to Kant and Hume, there's no Christian response. And then, of course, when Darwin wrote his book in around the 1830s, Origin of Species, the church didn't have an intelligent response because science was just thrown aside. We understand that science is a valuable tool that was created by God, and that God is the God, as my friend John Lennox would say, God is the God of the whole show. And when you start going and throwing out the intelligence of the Christian faith, when you start going out and throwing out some of the disciplines like philosophy, for example, some people were taking Colossians 2:8, and it says, have nothing to do with philosophy. Let me just turn there real quick so I can give you the general gist here. Colossians 2:8, Paul says, be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elemental forces of the world, and not based on Christ. Notice, I think what Christians have gone and done is they've forgot that last phrase, and not based on Christ, but they've gone and looked at philosophy as an evil in the church. And of course, when you start doing that, then it's critical thinking. Critical thinking has gone. You go and you look at science. Well, science can tell us a whole lot more new information. So we're going to go and we're going to let science come into the tent. And hence you had theistic evolution, you had all kinds of different scientific theories. And of course, when you deal with the discipline of ethics, that involves a lot of the mind and how to make certain choices. And you can see how ethical shifts throughout the culture and how throughout American history have just been compromised, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. So, getting to the close of our interview here, I wanted to ask you, since you're local apologist, where are we at with apologetics in the church and this anti-intellectualism? Where are we at now?
Wow.
In the area?
Well, in the area, we really need to find a way to break into the church. Mm-hmm. Really. So
you're meeting resistance?
We are meeting a lot of resistance, and I don't know whether if it's because of personal, I don't think it is, but when you start dealing with equipping your people to engage the culture, I am sure that I saw something written a while back, David, that about 30% of the people sitting in American churches today every Sunday, well, of course not now, but they're sitting at home or maybe not even watching a church service. So it's going to be interesting when the doors open up and the church start open up what the attendance is going to be like. But 30% of the American church is wondering whether or not the pastor in the pew believes what he's preaching every Sunday morning. I've actually had a conversation after reading that statement. I've talked to many people when I was in the car business, and even just like in the coffee shops when if we ever get involved in that conversation. Would you agree with this statement or disagree with the statement? I go and I bring that 30% up. They said, I agree with it wholeheartedly. I wonder whether or not my pastor even knows why he believes what he believes. So there is a resistance to apologetics. And I wrote a statement from the Bangor statement of my friends up at AIIA up in Bangor, Maine, because I think it's very much an important statement as far as apologetics, the role of apologetics in the Christian church. And of course, I haven't committed it to memory, but if you want to read it, you could definitely go to my blog, and it's there. I just put it up there last night.
And Rob, just one more time, where can we find your blog and your website?
You can go online at https roblundbergapologetics.com. You'll be able to see it there. You'll also see it under the FAQ section, drop down on the FAQ as far as FAQs about apologetics. We are registered in 128 countries. We are touching the world. We are touching the United States, and God has really blessed us with the amount of outreach that we've had with my webpage.
Well, there you go, folks. Go visit Rob and check out his material. That's it for our interview section, and we're going to break here for a segment and get started into a response video. We have a great response. Rob has elected to stay on with us as we respond to the godless engineer. Well, we as in me and Rob, because David decided not to show up today. So, but it's okay. We love him anyway.
That's okay.
We'll be back after these few messages.